Hello and welcome to the Diversity of Life 2 Lab. This video is being made to accompany the Diversity of Life 2 Lab that goes along with the environmental biology class at College of Lake County. So, to do a little reminder of what we talked about last week. So last week we said that all living things are split up into one of three different domains. The domain bacteria or Monera, the domain archaea, and the domain eukarya. Okay, we then split up the domain eukarya into four kingdoms: the kingdom Protista, the kingdom Fungi, the kingdom Plantae, and the kingdom Animalia. So last week we talked about the fungi and the plants. This week we're going to be focusing on the kingdom Protista, or the protists, and the kingdom Animalia, or the animals. So just kind of review real quickly what we talked about last week. So in the kingdom Protista, we're talking about critters that are small, but they're quite a bit bigger than bacteria are. So they're still microscopic, but not quite so small. These are unicellular. They are more complex than the bacteria are. Remember, the bacteria don't have a true nucleus, whereas anything in the kingdom Eukarya does. So the nucleus is that structure that's going to surround and protect the DNA of the cell. And we got two main types of protists. We've got the plant-like protists, which are called algae, like the pretty Spirogyra that you see here. And then we've got the animal-like protists that are called protozoa, like the paramecium that you see right here. So let's do a deep dive into the kingdom Protista, and then we'll really get into the kingdom Animalia. So we said there's two main types of protists. The first are the algae. So the algae are either single-celled organisms or they're colonial. And what we mean by colonial is that they're made up of individual cells that aren't necessarily specialized, so that you could theoretically pluck one of the cell in a colonial alga off, and you could use that to grow a new colony. Here we see a number of different types of algae. Here's another Spirogyra that you see up here, and it's named because it has this really pretty spiral arrangement of chloroplasts, which are the organelles or the part of the cell that have the chlorophyll, that green pigment, which is used for photosynthesis. We see some other unicellular algae here, Desmid, Chlamydomonas, and then here is a nice example of a colonial alga. This one looks like it has leaves, but the cells they're really colonies. So we could pluck off an individual cell and use that to grow a whole new one. So they're not really true leaves the way we saw with the plants. Algae are autotrophs, meaning they're able to make their own food using sunlight energy in a process called photosynthesis. Most algae are going to have a green pigment called chlorophyll. However, I will show you an example of some algae that actually have red pigments for photosynthesis, which aren't necessarily good. At least one of the byproducts from this alga are not good. We use algae for a variety of different things, right? They're an important part of an ecosystem. As autotrophs, they're eaten by lots of things. But we use them for food. Some people do eat algae. We can also see algae being grown commercially. Here you see these great big tubes. There's about 4,000 liters worth of liquid in here for growing algae. And in this case, the algae are being used to make algae oil, which is used as a fuel source. They use it in modified diesel engines. So how cool is that, right? Not having to drill down for petroleum, for oil, be able to make your own oil in a reactor like this. Pretty cool. But as I said, some algae are a problem because as they grow, they give off toxins. And characteristic of some of these algae are they are red. And when they grow in big numbers, they actually can color the water red, and these are called red tides. Here you can see, looking down from a pier, the algae are growing so thick it's orangey red in the water, and you can even see it, toxins released from the alga kill this fish. Here you see a view from several thousand feet up off the coast of California, and wow, how many algae have to be growing in here in order to dye the ocean red. certain types of red tides are dangerous. You wouldn't want to be swimming in them yourselves. And the toxins that are released by these algae can kill fish and other organisms. So it's a bad thing. We don't like to see this. And the other type of protists are the protozoa. And if we break down the word protozoa, the prefix proto means first. The suffix zoa means animal or animal-like. And we see this if we ever go to a zoo. The proper term for zoo is a zoological garden. And what do you go see at a zoological garden? You see animals. So the protists, the protozoa, excuse me, are the first of the eukaryotes that are going to be animal-like. So they're not going to be autotrophs, they're going to be heterotrophic. So these are animal-like protists here, like real pretty amoeba that you see there. Okay, we use protozoa for lots of different things. They can play an important role in the purification of water in water treatment plants. They're an important part of the food web, and they are all heterotrophs, right? So some of them are going to be predatory, so they're going to eat bacteria and algae and other protozoa. Some of them are scavengers, and there's some very important parasite protists too. If you've ever heard of malaria before, now malaria has killed more people throughout all of human history than all of the wars combined. And the protozoa that cause malaria, it's one of 4 different species of Plasmodium, these are going to be spread from people to people in mosquitoes. So if a mosquito that's carrying some of these protozoa in their gut infect a human, those protozoa are going to go to the liver, and they'll reproduce and make new different types of cells that are released back into the blood. In the blood, they're going to be changed into another format with both male and female forms. If that person that has these protozoa circulating in their blood is then bitten by another mosquito, that mosquito is going to take up the blood with these protozoa in it. The male and female gametes are going to fuse together in sexual reproduction. And then when that mosquito bites another uninfected person, they have passed on the Plasmodium to that person. So it does have a pretty significant economic impact, the malaria protozoa. All right, but we're going to be spending most of our time today talking about the kingdom Animalia. So the kingdom Animalia are the animals. These are multicellular. They are heterotrophs, so they are not able to make their own food. They have to consume food made by other organisms. And there are some other important characteristics about the animals that we need to be familiar with. So we're going to look at the symmetry in animals. We're going to look at the type of skeleton in the animals, segmentation, whether they're segmented or not, and the type of digestive system and the types of food that these organisms, these animals, are going to consume. All right, so let's break these things down. So what do we mean by symmetry? So the first type of symmetry is bilateral symmetry. So bi meaning two. So animals that have bilateral symmetry, you can divide into roughly equal left and right halves, like this that we see right here. So if you take the line, we can divide a human being which has bilateral symmetry into about equal left and right halves. Okay, some organisms, some animals are going to have radial symmetry. And radial symmetry is where you can take and draw a radius, so draw a line across more than one way in order to get roughly equal halves. So if we look at this jellyfish here, we could draw a line to give us symmetry in this way. We could also draw a line this way to give us symmetry. So if you can make a cut to give equal halves more than one way, that's going to be an example of radial symmetry. Now we have a modified form of radial symmetry in animals like sea stars, what we used to call starfish, and that's called pentaradial symmetry. So if we have a sea star here, the prefix penta means 5, like the pentagon. We could take little pie slices out and divide the sea star up into 5 equal parts along its central axis. So pentaradial symmetry there. And then some animals don't have any symmetry at all. They're just kind of growing off in different directions. And a real good example of this would be a sea sponge. And we'll talk more about all of these examples as we talk about the lab. Types of skeleton. Well, there are a number of different types of skeleton in the animals. So some animals don't have a skeleton at all. And a classic example of this would be the octopus. Now, this isn't to say that the octopus can't move and can't protect itself. It certainly has muscles and other structures for that, but it's not going to have a skeleton that's going to provide support. Some animals have what we call a hydrostatic skeleton. And here we see a sea star drawing. And the prefix hydro means water. So what sea stars do is they actually pump water. And imagine pumping up a balloon or a tube, and the more water that you put in there, the more rigid that it's going to be. That's certainly the case with the sea stars. So they have what we call a water vascular system. And by filling it full of water, it's going to provide support for the sea stars. Some animals have a skeleton on the outside, like the dragonfly that you see here. And there's one phylum of animals in particular, the arthropods, the phylum Arthropoda, that have external skeletons. And then some animals have their skeletons on the inside, like the humans. And there's a picture of a human skull and some vertebrae there. All right, we also see animals have segmentation. Some animals have segmentation. And what do I mean by segmentation is that we have the repetition of different body parts. So animals are either going to have segmentation or not. Here you see the really pretty black and gold millipede and the stag beetle. These definitely have segmentation. In fact, with the millipede, you can see here's a segment here, and it's going to have 2 pairs of legs, and then here's a segment here, which is going to have 2 pairs of legs, and so on and so on and so on. When we look at the beetle here, it's going to have a head segment, the thorax, and the abdomen. And you notice that there's pairs of legs coming out of the different segments here. Okay, so some animals are going to be segmented. Some animals, like the American white pelican that you see here, will not. Okay, different animals are going to have different types of digestive systems. So some animals don't have a digestive system at all. And a really classic example of this would be the pork tapeworm. So when the part of the life cycle of the pork tapeworm, which is inside of a human, for instance, they are attached to our intestine, and they're just able to absorb nutrients from our digestive tract into their body. So they don't have the need for a digestive system. Some animals are going to have a sac-like digestive system, which means there's just one hole to take stuff in, and then the stuff that you're done digesting goes out that same hole. And a nice example of this would be jellyfish. Here's a photograph of a jellyfish that you see right here. And then here is the opening that is both the mouth and the anus. So as it takes in food, it goes into the gut in here. When all the material that can be digested has been digested, the waste is going to go out the same hole. So we say that's a sac-like digestive system. And then we have the classic tube-like digestive system, which is what we see in humans. So here we see the esophagus, which is coming down from the mouth to go into the stomach. From the stomach, we're going to see movement into the small intestine, and then into the large intestine, and then finally out the other end through the rectum and out the anus. Okay, so a tube-like digestive system is what we see in humans. Feeding strategies. So different animals are going to eat different ways and different things. So an herbivore is an organism that's going to eat autotrophs. So they're going to eat organisms capable of photosynthesis, like the deer there. White-tailed deer, very common in this part of Illinois, and they are absolutely herbivorous. Some animals are filter feeders, and we can have really, really small filter feeders, very small animals floating around in the water column that are going to be filtering stuff out of the water, up to the very biggest organism on Earth, the whale shark, which when it opens its mouth, it's going to be straining plankton and small shrimp-like animals called krill. They are also filter feeders. Some animals are going to be predatory, like the red-tailed hawk that you see there. Some animals are going to be scavengers, like the turkey vulture that you see flying there. And some animals are going to be parasites, like the mosquito that you see there. So different animals are going to have different feeding strategies. So let's look at the different phyla. Again, phyla being the plural term for the word phylum. Let's look at the different phyla in the kingdom Animalia. So the first phylum we're going to look at in the kingdom Animalia is the phylum Porifera. And there's a little hint if you read Porifera, it has pores. So animals in the kingdom Porifera are the sponges. They're going to have lots of pores for bringing in food. Sponges are filter feeders, so their cells are going to have little cilia, these little hair-like structures, and as they beat, they're going to start a little water current, which can bring water and food particles inside the animal. Most sponges are marine, meaning that they live in the ocean. There are a few species of freshwater sponges, and actually, interestingly, when zebra mussels and quagga mussels, when they were introduced into the Great Lakes system, they are non-natives. And they're generally considered invasive and bad. But one good thing about that is that these animals have taken so much stuff out of the water that in some areas the water has been so clean that some freshwater sponges have been seen growing. So kind of interesting stuff. The sponges are sessile, which means as an adult they stay attached to a substrate. So once they start to grow, they will stay attached to that rock or whatever surface that they're on for the remainder of their life. As I said, they are filter feeders and they are not going to have a digestive system. As this picture shows, water is actually brought into the big opening here, which is called the osculum, using those hair-like cilia or flagella. That's actually going to cause the water to go into these pores, and as the water enters these pores, the cells there will strain out any food from the water, and then the water will exit through the side here. The sponges do not have a skeleton. Some sponges, what we call the glass sponges, will have these little spicules of stuff like glass. That's why they're called the glass sponges. And that gives a little bit of shape to the sponge, but not all sponges are going to have it. And those sponges are, spongy. You can wring them up, and that's why people use them for washing. Next phylum is the phylum Cnidaria. Now I know this one sounds a little weird. The C in Cnidaria is silent. But these are the stinging-celled animals. These are animals that have structures called nematocysts, and these are pretty cool. So here you see a picture from a type of a cnidarian called a hydra, which is a very small freshwater animal. And these nematocysts are essentially teeny tiny little microscopic harpoons. So if you look at the nematocyte, cnidocyte, at the tip of the green arrow here, here is the cell that has the nematocyst all coiled up inside. Now when the animal detects that there is a prey species next to it, the nematocyst actually penetrates the cell, goes out, and will jab into the prey animal, injecting poison, and that can then be used to reel in the food. So pretty cool stuff here. Animals in the phylum Cnidaria are going to include the jellyfish, like this one that you see here, and the nematocysts would be on the tentacles that are hanging down. Coral are in the phylum Cnidaria, so they're going to have some stinging cells. And sea anemones. And if you've seen the movie Finding Nemo, you know a little bit about sea anemones. They're going to have their nematocysts and their tentacles here. These do not sting the clownfish that are in a mutualistic relationship with them. The clownfish have a thick layer of mucus around them. So the clownfish, being in this case nice and bright and orange and white, can swim along the tentacles and are not harmed by the sea anemone at all, but they act as bait. So as some other fish comes around to go eat the clownfish, that fish swims into the anemone, is stung by the nematocysts, and that fish is going to be eaten by the sea anemone. So the sea anemone helps the clownfish because it provides protection for the clownfish, and the clownfish act as bait to attract food to the sea anemone. So pretty cool arrangement there. Different cnidarians have different abilities to move. So once a sea anemone is an adult, it stays attached or sessile for the remainder of its life. Hydra, and the same with coral, so coral stay attached. Hydra and jellyfish are able to swim in their adult forms. So some of them move, some of them do not. They exhibit radial symmetry, like that picture I showed you a few slides back. And they have a sac-like digestive tract. And they are predators, and the coral are filter feeders. Next phylum, and this is a great big word, the phylum Platyhelminthes. If we break this down, the prefix platy means plate-like. Helminth means worm. So literally, the phylum Platyhelminthes are made up of the flatworms. And here you can see a type of flatworm called a planaria. They are fairly flattened. They look cross-eyed because their eye spots are pointing inward. They have a relatively simple digestive tract. They have simple nervous system here, but their key characteristic is they are flat. They do exhibit bilateral symmetry. And they have a sac-like digestive tract. And you find these in both freshwater and marine environments. And they are primarily scavengers and parasites. So here you see a couple of the scavenging types of flatworms here. This is called Bedford's flatworm, and this is a planaria. And here's a couple of parasitic flatworms. So this is a fluke of some sort. And this is a tapeworm, and you may have heard of tapeworms before because many tapeworms actually have part of their life cycle where they can live in humans, and each of the little parts of the tapeworm here is an individual little segment called a proglottid. So here is some information from the Centers for Disease Control about the pork tapeworm, Taenia solium, and similar to a couple of other tapeworms. So in humans, I had mentioned before, these don't have a digestive tract. So they have hooks and suckers that when human eats undercooked meat, so that's why they say, be really careful when you're eating pork. Make sure that pork, and actually all meats, are cooked all the way through. But if we eat meat that is not completely cooked and it's got some of these immature forms of the worm in it, they start to grow, can live in our digestive tract, and can be really long, feet long. Each one of these little segments or proglottids is actually going to have both male and female reproductive structures. So as they mature, they fertilize themselves, they produce eggs, and when humans defecate, we are releasing, if somebody's infected, they're releasing all these eggs. If a cow or pig comes along and eats something with these eggs on them, these start growing inside the cow or the pig. And when humans come along and eat the undercooked meat, then this cycle can continue over and over and over again. Next phylum is the phylum Mollusca, or the mollusks. And we've got a number of different types of mollusks that are actually quite different from one another. So you've got the snails and the slugs, like this land snail picture I took a number of years ago. You've got clams, mussels, oysters, and scallops. And there's some scallops that you see there. Octopi and squid, and there's a squid for you. So all of these are mollusks, interestingly enough. They do have bilateral symmetry. You find them in a terrestrial environment on land, like the snail and some slugs. Not all snails are on land, but some of them are. Some of them are marine, they live in salt water. Some of them live in fresh water. They have a tube-like digestive tract, so there's an opening at the mouth for bringing stuff in and a mouth opening at the anus to get rid of undigestible material. And they have lots of different feeding strategies. So herbivores, like this particular snail that you see right here, would be moving along on plants and would be eating and breaking down plant material. Some mollusks are scavengers. Some of them are filter feeders, so your clams, your mussels, your oysters, and your scallops, these are primarily filter feeders. They'll open up their shells, the proper term for that is the valves, and they'll actually cause water to move in, and they will filter stuff out of the water. And when you think of the squid and the octopi, they're actually pretty good predators, so they'll eat lots of other stuff. So these animals do not have a true skeleton. Some of them have a shell, and here you see the shell of the snail. I had said in the clams and the mussels and the scallops and the oysters, they have something called a valve. That's why these are sometimes called bivalves, because they have two of them. The squid and the oysters, or excuse me, the squid and the octopi don't have a shell. They have this little remnant of, the squid do, they have this little remnant of a shell inside of them called the pen. That if we look at the embryos, we can see originated from tissues and other mollusks that would go on to produce their shell. Next phylum is the phylum Annelida. These are the roundworms. So these are going to include things like earthworms that you see there, leeches. Now, I'm sure you've heard of leeches before. Leeches get kind of a bad rap. They are parasites. There are leeches that are not parasites. In fact, many of the ones that we find in Illinois are going to be more scavengers. The medicinal leech here that you see, Hirudo medicinalis, was used historically when we were bleeding people, when they thought that there was a problem with the blood. Believe it or not, medicinal leeches are used today. If somebody has, for instance, a limb transplant, where you go in, or not a transplant, but somebody has an amputation and they are trying to reattach the limb, some of the very small blood vessels just are too small to be reattached, and as a result, blood would pool up in the limb. So sometimes what they do is they'll actually put leeches on that reattached limb, and the leeches will get rid of that extra blood so that it will restore proper blood flow until it can heal. So pretty cool stuff. And then we have the microscopic annelids that are called nematodes. And I remember taking a class in graduate school, and the teacher was an expert in nematodes. And he had us out on a field trip one day, and we were looking down from a bluff on the Mississippi River down towards the river, and there was really nice curving topography to the land. And he said, there's so many nematodes in soil that if you would take away the soil particles, you would still see the topography because of all the nematodes in it. And this particular nematode that you see here, sometimes called C. elegans, is pretty commonly used in studies because it's made up of a certain fixed number of cells, and we can see what happens to those cells during development. The annelids have superficial segments. So if you look at the earthworm here in particular, you see it looks superficially on the skin like they have segments. These are not actually whole segments, so we don't see repeating parts like we will in the arthropods, but they are superficially segmented, we can say. And they do have bilateral symmetry, so we can divide them into left and right, and they have tube-like digestive tracts. As far as feeding strategies go, many of them are decomposers, but as we said, some of them, like some of the leeches, are parasites. Next phylum is the phylum Arthropoda, and this is a biggie. So these are the jointed-legged animals that are going to have an exoskeleton. So they're going to have their skeleton on the outside. And in fact, in terms of number of species, there are more arthropod species than there are any other phylum of animals. So we find lots of different arthropods out there. And it includes pretty diverse group, like the insects are arthropods, like this Luna moth that you see there. Crustaceans are going to be arthropods. So here you see a Japanese spider crab, lobsters, crayfish, all of those are crustaceans. Spiders are going to be arthropods, like this cool, really neat camouflaged spider, a white-banded crab spider that I found growing on a sunflower in the CLC prairie. Arthropods are going to have bilateral symmetry. You can divide them into left and right. They're going to have tube-like digestive tracts and definite segments. Some of the arthropods are going to be herbivores, like the Luna moth over here. They're going to eat exclusively plants. Some arthropods are going to be scavengers, like the crabs, although crabs can be predatory too. But many of the arthropods are going to be predatory, like the spider that you see. And some of them are parasites. So when we had the picture of the mosquito up a little while ago, mosquitoes are parasites. We find them on land, they're terrestrial, some of them are marine, some of them are freshwater. So like we said, there's lots of different arthropods out there. We're going to find them in lots of different places. Next phylum is the phylum Echinodermata, which I know is another one of those big names, but if we break it down, echino means spiny, derm, like the dermis, means skin. So the echinoderms are the spiny-skinned animals. And the real classic example of these are the sea stars, or what we used to call starfish. And this is a real neat example of a sea star that's going to show another trait we're going to talk about in a minute. But here you can see the sea star. It's using its tube feet, which it moves using its water vascular system to move along. This is a coral. And the way that sea stars feed, they actually evert their stomach. They can actually send their stomach out of their body. In this case, it's wrapping around the coral, and it is literally dissolving away the coral and then absorbing the nutrients, which is the stuff of horror movies if you're a coral, but pretty cool if you're a human watching what's going on there. Sand dollars are also echinoderms. Now, this is a dried sand dollar. In life, you wouldn't be able to see much of the pentaradial symmetry there. You can still kind of see that. There would be projections on the dorsal surface of the sand dollar here, and then other tube feety kind of stuff on the bottom to help it move. Sea urchins are also echinoderms, and we know them because they have all these little spines that are coming out of them that they use for protection. All right, so more characteristics of the echinoderms then. So they have either pentaradial or radial symmetry. It's pretty easy to see on the sea star here. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arms. So that would be pentaradial symmetry. We can do some pie slices to separate into 5 equal segments. On this dried sand dollar here, you can see how easy it is to separate these into the 5 pieces. So they have pentaradial symmetry. The sea urchin that you see here is more just radial symmetry. They do have a hydrostatic skeleton, so they are going to use water to give them some strength and to help them move things like their tube feet for moving along. They do not have segments, but they do have a sac-like digestive system. As far as feeding strategies, some of them, like the sea star over here, are going to be predatory, going around and eating coral. Some of them eat fish and other animals. Some of them are going to be scavengers. Some of them, like the sea urchin over here, are going to be more herbivorous. They're going to crawl along and eat algae that's growing on coral and other surfaces. And the next phylum is the phylum Chordata. And animals in the phylum Chordata are going to have a spinal cord. And in this human model that you see right here, you can see spinal cord in yellow. And they're even showing some of the bony structures that we put around that really important spinal cord to help protect it, which are called vertebra. The plural form is vertebrae. So another name that we have for animals in the phylum Chordata, since most of these animals are going to have vertebrae, we can also call them the vertebrates. And there are a few that have that lack the vertebrae or have something kind of primitive, but most of the chordates, those animals in the phylum Chordata, are going to have vertebra. Certainly the ones we're talking about here. And then all other animals that do not have vertebrae and do not have a spinal cord are collectively called the invertebrates. So some other characteristics besides the presence of a spinal cord that we need to talk about with the chordates as we look at the different classes of the phylum Chordata. We're going to look at how do they reproduce, do they control their temperature or not. Animals that are ectothermic are what we call cold-blooded, which essentially means that their temperature is the temperature of the environment around them. Some animals are going to be endothermic or warm-blooded, meaning they have the ability to regulate their temperature. So their temperature can be warmer than the environment around them. And for many of these, we'll also look at external coverings. So when we look at fish, there are two classes of fish. We have the class Chondrichthyes and the class Osteichthyes. So fish with a skeleton made of cartilage belong to the phylum Chondrichthyes, and these are going to include things like sharks, skates, and rays. Here's a picture I took while snorkeling in Maui. This was a spotted eagle ray. So these do not have a skeleton made of bone. They have jaw and teeth, but mainly their skeleton is going to be made up of cartilage. Fish that have a bony skeleton are in the class Osteichthyes. Osteo means bone. In general, we kind of lump the cartilaginous fish and the bony fish together because they share many of the characteristics with the exception of their skeleton. A good example of bony fish is a fish that's native to Illinois called the long-nosed gar. And there you see two of them I took a picture of at an aquarium. Actually, there's even a third in the back. We find the bony fish and the cartilaginous fish both in freshwater and marine environments. They do not do well, most of them outside of water. So here's kind of an interesting picture I took a number of years ago. I was walking on Credit Island, which is a park on the Mississippi River near Bettendorf, Iowa. And there had just been a few weeks before a massive flood. It was Mississippi River jumped its banks and flooded lots of stuff. And it flooded so high that the water level went higher than this chain link fence. And one of these long-nosed gar swam into the fence, and when the water dropped, it died. So, little rule, fish don't do real well. Most of them don't do real well out of water for very long. Or, if they're caught in a chain link fence. Fish are covered with skin. Many of them are covered with scales, but not all. They are ectothermic, meaning they do not have the ability to regulate their temperature. There are a few fish, like tuna, that have an interesting circulatory system that can regulate their temperature a little bit. But for the most part, when we're talking about fish, we're talking about the fact that they're cold-blooded or ectothermic. And they're going to lay either jelly-like eggs in the water, or if you look at some of the Chondrichthyes, some of the cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, they'll actually have kind of leathery pouch around their eggs, helping to protect them. Okay, some fish are filter feeders, like for instance the whale shark picture that I showed earlier was a real good example of a filter feeder. Some fish are herbivorous. They're going to eat only plants and algae, although many fish are carnivorous and some of them are scavengers. Next group of chordates are animals in the class Amphibia. And if we look at the amphibians and break down the word, amphi means both. So when we look at amphibians, the adults can live both on land or in the water, depending on the species. Some of them live only on the land, some of them live in the land and the water, but they're called both because the adults, when they reproduce, they have to reproduce in the water. So even the totally terrestrial ones that live on land, like the toads, they still have to go back to the water to reproduce. So that's amphi, meaning they live on both land and water. So amphibians are going to lay jelly-like eggs in the water, so the eggs are not going to have a hard shell around them. And the larvae are going to be aquatic. And here's a really neat example. If we look at the eastern newt that we see here. So an adult eastern newt, a female is going to lay her eggs that are fertilized by the male in the water. The eggs develop and then they hatch into a larva, and the larva has to live in the water. After a while, they grow into this terrestrial form, which is called an eft. And the red eft stage of the eastern newt actually crawls around on land for a period of time, up to a year or two. And then they go back into the water, and then they spend the rest of their life in the water. So the newts are neat salamanders as amphibians. So when we look at the different types of amphibians, the two big types are the frogs, like the big bullfrog that you see right here, and the salamanders, like the really pretty Yanalasi salamander picture I took here. They are all ectothermic. They cannot regulate their temperature. They have skin as the covering. They are, as adults, almost exclusively carnivorous. Most of the larvae, well, I shouldn't say most, some of the larvae, like the larvae of the frogs, are herbivorous, and we call those tadpoles. However, interestingly, the salamander larvae are not herbivorous. They're going to be primarily predatory. So there are some stages of amphibians, the larva form of the frogs, for instance, that are herbivorous. A lot of them are going to be carnivorous. They're going to be eating other organisms, though. Next class in the phylum Chordata is the class Reptilia. These are the reptiles. So these animals are going to be able to lay leathery eggs on land. And because they've got this leathery shell around them, that's going to keep them from drying out. There are adult reptiles that can live on land. There are some that live almost exclusively in the water. But they also, those that are aquatic, still come back to land to lay their eggs. And some examples of the reptiles include the lizards, like this plumed basilisk picture I took when I was in Costa Rica. The common name for this lizard is the Jesus Christ lizard. You may have seen this before because it can actually run so fast that it can run on the surface of the water. Turtles are reptiles, like this painted turtle picture I took. The snakes are also reptiles, like the garter snake that you see here. And then finally the crocodilians, so alligators, crocodiles, gharials. These are animals that are reptiles, right? So many of them spend much of their lives in the water, but they come back to lay their eggs on land. These are cold-blooded, so they are not able to regulate their temperature. They tend to have leathery skin, some of them, like the crocodilians there. Some of them, like the turtles, are going to have a bony carapace or a shell, and some of them, like the snakes, are going to have scales. So lots of different types of skin coverings in the reptiles. Many of them are carnivorous, so they're going to be eating other things for food. Some of them are herbivorous. Some of the lizards are herbivores. Some of the turtles are herbivores. Many of them are scavengers, so lots of scavenger turtles in particular, although alligators will scavenge dead stuff too. Next class is the class Aves, and these are the birds. So here's the first instance where we see warm-blooded animals. So these animals are able to regulate their temperature and be warmer than the environment when the environment is cold. One of the ways they can do this is by having feathers, and by fluffing up their feathers, they can trap a layer of warm air close to their skin. Birds do lay hard-shelled eggs. Some birds are carnivorous, like the snowy owl picture that you see up in the top, and the double-crested cormorant with that nice big hooked beak. They're really good at diving for and catching fish. Some birds are herbivorous. They're going to be eating plant material, like the cedar waxwing that you see up there and the ruby-throated hummingbird. And before you say anything, I know this one doesn't have a ruby throat. It's just the males that have the ruby on the throat. If you would see it, it would be right here. And you can only see it when the sun is hitting it in the right direction. And then some birds are going to be scavengers, like the turkey vulture that you see here. Can you see why it's called a turkey vulture with the head that doesn't have any feathers on it? It's evolved to have lost its feathers because when a turkey vulture finds a dead animal to eat, if it would be sticking its head into the body cavity of, say, a dead raccoon, its feathers would get all gunked up from the dead guts in there. So they've actually evolved to lost the feathers on their head, which is interesting adaptation. And then finally, the last class in the phylum Chordata that we're going to talk about is the class Mammalia. These are the mammals. So mammals are also endothermic or warm-blooded. They have hair, or at least some mammals do. Actually, all mammals have hair. Some have less than others, and some of us lose it as we get older. Mammals give birth to live young, so we do not have eggs. There are two species of mammals that do lay eggs, the echidna and the duck-billed platypus, which are very, very simple mammals. We call them monotremes. But most mammals are going to be giving birth to live young. They do feed their young milk. And for examples, we have some mammals that are carnivorous, like this red fox that you see here. Some of them are herbivorous, like this Florida manatee, which we were really lucky to come across. We were out taking pictures, and this manatee just popped its head up out of the water and started grazing on some of the leaves of the shrub that was hanging over the water there. And some mammals are going to be scavengers, and some mammals eat hats. Here's actually a picture I took when I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail. I'd taken my backpack and my hat off, and some wild ponies came up to us, and the horse enjoyed chewing on my hat, which was soaked with sweat. So it was taking the salt out of my sweat there. Darn hat. Fortunately, I kept the hat, though. Hat was still okay. So if you're a student in one of my classes, you know that we're going to have a lab quiz on the material from this lab. So if you are preparing for your quiz for next week, you're going to need to know the levels of classification. So know the domains, know the kingdoms, know phylum, know all of this. So domain down through species. Know the particular ones that we talked about. So in the domain Eukarya, we talked about the kingdom Protista and the kingdom Animalia. We said there were two different types of protists, the algae and the protozoa. We said there's lots of different types of animals, and we broke down the different phyla of animals, and then for the phylum Chordata, we broke down the classes. If we talked about it in here, if it's in the lab book, you do need to know it, and you do need to spell those things properly. In addition, where we talked about terms like ectothermic, endothermic, symmetry, okay, all of those things are fair game for a quiz for next week. Now, I will be honest with you. Remembering how to spell things like Platyhelminthes, remember the flatworms, or Echinodermata, the echinoderms, the spiny-skinned animals, I know that can be problematic if you're not planning on studying zoology. So I will, for this case only, provide a word list for you to choose from, okay? But please, if I'm giving you a word list where it is spelled properly, please make sure that you actually spell it properly. If you misspell something from a word list, well, yeah, you're going to lose the points for that. So no one will be able to explain the characteristics of the groups of organisms that we discussed, and like I said, you will be given a word list of the phyla. So that's all there is for the Diversity of Life 2 lab. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for your hard work. Take care, stay healthy, and we'll see you around.